The scenario involves a masonry block building with synthetic stucco finish where a 2-inch conduit is to be installed from a transformer to the service disconnect directly on the exterior masonry block, then concealed behind the stucco. The question is whether this is considered outside or inside the building for compliance with NEC 230.70. A1 regarding the location of the disconnect. NEC 230.70. A1 states that the service disconnect mean shall be installed at a readily accessible location either outside of a building or structure or inside nearest the point of entrance of the service conductors. Let's analyze the arguments for both inside and outside the building. Firstly, the argument for inside the building. Because the conduit is concealed behind the synthetic stucco, it effectively becomes part of the interior wall assembly. Therefore, the disconnect would be installed inside the building near the point of entrance of the service conductors. Secondly, the argument for outside the building. The conduit extends from the transformer to the service disconnect, which are both located outside the building. If the conduit is visible and accessible from outside, it could be considered an exterior component. However, the prevailing interpretation leans towards the location of the disconnect being considered inside the building in this case. This is primarily because the conduit is concealed behind the exterior finish and is not readily accessible from outside the building without removing the stucco. Therefore, the service disconnect would likely be compliant with NEC 230.70. A1 if it is installed inside the building nearest the point of entrance of the service conductors. It is important to remember that local interpretations can vary, so consulting with the local authority having jurisdiction is always advisable. Furthermore, several factors influence the interpretation. Firstly, accessibility. If the conduit can be easily accessed from outside without damaging the stucco, it might lean towards being considered outside. Secondly, visibility. If the conduit is partially visible or its presence is clearly indicated from the exterior, this could also influence the decision. Thirdly, the intent of the code. The primary intent of NEC 230.70. A1 is to ensure a readily accessible disconnect for emergency responders and service personnel. Concealing the conduit might impede this accessibility. While the described scenario leans towards being considered inside, it's crucial to have a clear understanding of the specific circumstances and local regulations. The decision ultimately rests with the authority having jurisdiction. To further clarify, let's break down the key aspects of NEC 230.70. A1. The phrase readily accessible implies that the disconnect can be reached quickly and without obstruction. Concealing the conduit behind stucco makes the disconnect less readily accessible from the exterior. The phrase outside of a building or structure means that the disconnect must be located outside the physical confines of the building. If the conduit is considered part of the building's exterior, this argument becomes less clear. The phrase inside nearest the point of entrance of the service conductors means that if the disconnect is inside, it must be as close as possible to where the service conductors enter the building. This is a safety measure to minimize the length of unprotected conductors inside the building. In the given scenario, the concealed conduit blurs the lines between inside and outside. The determining factor is likely to be the degree to which the conduit is integrated into the building's exterior and its accessibility. It's also worth noting that other sections of the NEC might be relevant, such as those pertaining to the protection of service conductors and the installation of raceways. The engineer's design should consider all applicable codes and standards. In conclusion, while the argument could be made for either inside or outside, the most likely interpretation is that the disconnect would be considered inside the building due to the conduit being concealed behind the stucco. However, a final determination should be made in consultation with the local authority having jurisdiction, taking into account the specific details of the installation and local code interpretations. When dealing with electrical installations, adherence to the NEC and local codes is paramount for safety and compliance. This scenario highlights the importance of clear communication between engineers, contractors, and inspectors to ensure that all requirements are met.